This is Reform and the Roaring Twenties Objective 1 about the legacy of one of the most interesting characters to ever be in the presidency, Theodore Roosevelt. Now, Teddy's going to be president from 1901 to 1909, but if you take a look at letter A here in the outline, in the election of 1900, Teddy Roosevelt wasn't the presidential candidate. William McKinley was. Now, McKinley had been elected in 1896, and things had gone really well with the first term, with all the prosperity and everything along those lines. Americans were pretty happy. Plus, McKinley was a really nice guy. Now, everybody understood why McKinley was being nominated for president again. The pick that raised eyebrows a little bit was this one, Teddy Roosevelt, who was being nominated for vice president. Now, Roosevelt, a couple things I want you to jot down in the notes here. Roosevelt had been Assistant Secretary of the Navy and played a role in the beginning of the Spanish-American War from that position. More on that later when we study foreign policy in the spring. But I think the biggest thing is that he'd been elected governor of New York because of his time that he had served in the Spanish-American War. He was a bit of a cowboy and a hero. You can see him right here. He had actually left his post as Assistant Secretary of the Navy to start what was called the Rough Rider Regiment, and there he is in the front. He's a co-founder of it. And he basically, in his prior years, he'd been a cowboy and a rancher, so he got a bunch of cowboy and ranching buddies together and formed this regiment. They're an interesting group. We'll talk about them later. Now, at one point, Teddy Roosevelt, in starting the regiment, because he was wealthy, although he didn't want people to really know that, had gone to Brooks Brothers and had his own private uniform made for the Spanish-American War. He liked the conflict, and he was, in essence, a war hero, so that got him elected to governor of New York. The thing is that he was put in that position, though, because while governor of New York, he had reformed a lot of trusts, and he had caused problems for political bosses there. They made him vice president. I want you to jot this down. They made him vice president to basically keep him out of the way. Vice presidents never have anything to do, so they basically thought if they could hide him in the vice presidency, he would cause them a lot less problems. He wasn't there because he would have been a great vice president or great president in their eyes. He was there to be kept out of the way. Now, Roosevelt was a character even on the campaign trail, and when he went around from place to place, he brought cowboys with him, firing pistols into the air, and Roosevelt wearing a cowboy hat and pounding his fist on the table and speaking very largely and eloquently, and it was a sight. I'm sure it had to be, and that as a result got a lot of votes for McKinley, and made a lot of Republicans pretty nervous that Roosevelt was one bullet away from being president. Okay, so anyway, with the election, William Jennings Bryan is put up again to run by the Democrats, just like he had been in 1896. And since things had gone so well, as McKinley had promised, you can see here the writing, the full dinner pail. McKinley had promised that every American would have a full dinner pail. Well, increased wages and prosperity became the reasons that William Jennings Bryan lost. And when it was all said and done, you can see here that William Jennings Bryan had taken most of the South, but McKinley had taken all of the North, and he wins 292 to 155 in the Electoral College. Now, unfortunately for McKinley, the good times aren't going to last. Shortly into his second term, he's assassinated, and Teddy Roosevelt now steps into the role as president, the youngest president we've ever had to this day, 42 years old. Now, one thing that's noteworthy here as well, John F. Kennedy is often credited as being the youngest president. John F. Kennedy is the youngest elected president. Teddy Roosevelt is the youngest president to ever actually sit in the chair by taking over for McKinley, and was older than Kennedy was when he got elected to his own term. But Teddy Roosevelt is the youngest president, and Kennedy's the youngest elected one. Okay, so who is this guy, Teddy Roosevelt? We'll take a look at letter B on the outline and jot a couple things down here as they come up. If you follow the list there, you can see that once again he was 42 years old when he took office. He was born into a very wealthy family in New York and educated at Harvard. As a child, he was very sickly. Most people don't realize that because when he gets to be an adult, he's kind of known as a very boisterous man's man. Here's Teddy right here. But he had asthma very badly as a child and was seen as, even into his teenage years, was seen as a bit of a dandy. Well, Teddy set out to change that image, so he put himself on a very strict exercise regimen to improve his conditions, and eventually turned himself into kind of or at least wanted to portray the image of someone as a rough and tumble outdoorsman. He didn't like getting picked on as a kid for being asthmatic and for dressing in fancy clothes. Sometimes he took that a little bit too far. This is a picture he had made for himself to improve his public image when he was thinking about running for office in his early years. He's sporting himself as a hunter, but one thing that's interesting is the multi-moneyed pearl-handled knife that he bought himself. It didn't really signify rugged individual. So, but the image does work, and Teddy Roosevelt becomes known as an outdoorsman and a man's man and that type of thing, even with the fancy knife right here. Now, I don't know if you remember from the last lesson, but there was a guy named Mark Hanna who had backed up McKinley's campaign, and one of the things he was mostly worried about would be that, this quote-unquote damned cowboy was one bullet away from being president. Well, that's because Roosevelt at one time was a cowboy. If you look at number 4, he in the Dakotas, both north and south, he had worked as a ranch owner and a cowboy before he even got into politics. But the single greatest thing, Teddy Roosevelt, whether you agree or disagree with his politics, is one of my favorite presidents because he had an energy about him that was easy to see. Take a look at B5. He's known as the human cartoon because of his appearance, his energy. He had a huge ego. He loved being the center of the room. He loved everybody paying attention to him, and he was a loud dude. He was a straight-out cartoon character. Overall, Teddy Roosevelt was just really, really interesting as a person. Like I said, huge ego, huge personality. He went on African safari hunts. He went on hunts out in the American West, hunts to Canada. He loved going hunting. Here's a big game hunt where he takes down an elephant. And here's a picture of him riding a moose. This has got to be one of my favorite pictures I've ever seen of the guy. Who does this, really? It's just kind of a classic sign of how much this guy loved being outdoors, loved being in nature, and how brazen the guy actually was. Really, who hops on a moose and rides it across a river? But Teddy had a little bit of a soft side, and at one point he came across a bear cub that he refused to shoot. He ended up taking it home as a pet in the White House, and as a result, a new toy was developed called the teddy bear. I think that's noteworthy as well. Named after Teddy Roosevelt. And because of this love of being outdoors, he was well known as an environmentalist who built up U.S. parks. But most of all, with his big ego and excessive amounts of testosterone, Teddy Roosevelt, as has been said a number of times, was a man's man. And he believed, more so than prior presidents, that a president should be very, very bold in his actions, even if it means being stronger than Congress. And that's something in Teddy Roosevelt's legacy that's going to last for the rest of the 20th century. So what does Roosevelt do in terms of domestic policies? We'll take a look at letter C here. You can see here that his big thing, and I want you to circle this under number 2, is this is kind of a precursor to FDR's New Deal. Teddy calls for the square deal for the American people, controlling corporations, protecting consumers, and conserving the environment. He had developed the Department of Commerce and Labor after a coal mine strike in 1902, when the owners refused to negotiate with the workers. Roosevelt basically felt that this was a pretty nasty thing to do, and actually calls the owners to the White House. I mean, he was kind of a take a bull by the horns kind of guy. And basically the owners consented to arbitrate with the workers, and Roosevelt felt there needed to be a department developed that could step in when these kind of labor strikes happened. So he develops the Department of Commerce and Labor. But back to the square deal now. Teddy takes on a series of measures. If you look at C3 to control corporations, circle the Elkins Act of 1903 and the Hepburn Act of 1906, very big in stopping bribes on railroads. He actually also, if you look at 3B, gets a reputation as a trust buster, taking on J.P. Morgan of all people and breaking apart one of his railroad trusts. That was upheld in the Supreme Court, and Teddy Roosevelt sues 40 more trust companies. Now, this was kind of right up Roosevelt's alley, and he's getting a reputation as a trust buster, which the people, the public, loved. But in truth, if you take a look at letter C, he didn't break up every trust. He was a pretty good friend of big business. The ones he was worried about were the ones that he felt were greedy and monopolistic. Those were the ones he went after. Some trusts, some monopolies, he thought were okay. So there's a little bit of myth to this reputation of his as a trust buster. But that public image of him being a trust buster carried on well past his time. You can see in the comic book here, Teddy Roosevelt, the trust buster. He became legendary for that, but again, the reality was that it was a little bit of a myth. Although, makes for interesting comics. Bull Moose Comics here, okay, and Teddy Roosevelt's favorite phrase that he would use often. A couple of things that Teddy Roosevelt does to protect consumers on C4, and this is noteworthy. A book called The Jungle had been written by Upton Sinclair detailing how rat parts and splinters, wood shavings, stuff scraped off the floor had made their way into meat in the meatpacking industry. Teddy Roosevelt heard these reports and passed the 1906 Meat Inspection Act, which allowed for inspectors to go in and check out meatpacking practices to make sure they were safe for people. Also, here's a candy factory, and you can see the inspector in the background. What was passed was the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906. Food and drugs didn't used to have dates on them indicating when they could spoil. I mean, if you bought bad milk, it was considered your own fault, or bad meat. Well, because of this, everybody had to put labels on their products, so he was protecting consumers as well. And of course, the last part of his square deal was conserving the environment, especially after the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution had caused a lot of smoke in the air, drilled into the ground, and it really done some damage to the environment. So Teddy Roosevelt set aside land for U.S. national parks. That had been done, if you look at 5A, that had been done in 1891, well before his presidency. But Teddy Roosevelt set up dams and added another 125 million acres for new parks, which was 3 times the previous amount. He even banned Christmas trees from the White House just because he didn't want to cut trees down. This is a picture of him in Yosemite National Park. For the most part, everybody liked what Roosevelt was doing, and he finishes out McKinley's term and then is elected to one in 1904, and I want you to circle this under letter D. He wouldn't run again. He announced he would not run again just because he didn't want to be seen as a king. That ended up being kind of a critical mistake because later he would want to run again, but more on that later. Roosevelt had a guy in mind to be president with him, so he handpicks William H. Taft to succeed him in 1908 and says this is the guy who's going to... Sorry, I cut myself short there. He says that this is the guy who's going to carry on my policies. And in this political cartoon, Teddy is handing off his policies to William Howard Taft as he's on his way to an African lion hunt. Some of Teddy's enemies wish the lions would take care of Teddy and have a nice meal. They made that public that they didn't really wish him the best. But it didn't happen. William Howard Taft would not continue Roosevelt's policies. Roosevelt feels like Taft betrayed him, and he would eventually get back into politics. Okay, thanks a lot.